Mr. Douglass is recruiting. He's recruiting both for the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, amongst the first 23 individuals he recruited, 2 of them were his own sons, Lewis Douglass and Charles Douglass. Both of those individuals end up fighting for the 54th. When they get to Fort Wagner, Lewis is in that battle. Charles is not in that battle, and at some point, Charles ends up in the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry. Try to figure out why. If you look at pictures of Charles, you'll see Charles's eyes are bulging out a bit. I've had 2 doctors to corroborate this. He probably has some sort of thyroid issue, which affects your vision because you got fat building behind your eyes. Well, let me tell you something. If you in infantry, you better be able to see you through your sights, or you ain't gonna be on that field long. You'll be taken off one way or the other. So he's not even there. But Lewis is down there, and we've got the depiction of the storming of Fort Wagner. Now, you know, a regiment on paper is about 1,000 people. By the time they get there, it's about 600. They lose 45% of their manpower in that charge. But you know what? For a lot of those guys, there was something more important than living. They were willing to die. What I found interesting is I've studied African Americans in U.S. military history. I remember one day I was in the Library of Congress, and I think this is I was in grad school, this is probably my Black history class. I tell you, one day it all just seemed to come together at one point, and I just put my head down in my hand. And I shed a few tears, and I asked myself the question, what do black folk have to do to prove themselves as citizens, patriotic, loyal, willing to put their body on the line for something greater? So that's what these guys are doing. I mean, they're going after a fort that is probably impossible with the manpower that they had to take. And they didn't take it. But you could not say those guys weren't fighters. And you see it throughout all of our history. You saw it in the Revolutionary War. You saw it in World War I. You definitely saw it in World War II. So Douglass is instrumental in getting those guys to fight. And there are other battles that those guys will fight. But what I find interesting is, and this is why we're so grateful to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who's the founder of, at the time it was Negro History Week, African American History Month, because that story wasn't told. You got people that they had no idea. There was a high school group I saw at one point, and they had no idea the blacks fought in the Civil War. Yes. And 209,000 of them in the Army and the Navy didn't know it. And after the war, nobody talked about it. Officers on both sides telling their story. Then the listeners on both sides start telling their story. Civilians on both sides telling their story. You know what part of the story not being told? The black part. They ain't telling it. But here's what blacks used to do. They used to have what they called Emancipation Day. And they would, in 3 things they'd accomplish every Emancipation Day. They would celebrate the emancipation of the slaves, or at least the Emancipation Proclamation. They would celebrate their Civil War veterans who fought, and they would also raise money for scholarships to educate their children, because they knew if blacks were going to be successful, you had to be able to negotiate your own work contract, you had to be able to own property, you had to be able to educate yourself, and you had to be able to vote if you're going to be successful. And when you don't see yourself in history, Dr. Woodson says this, if you're almost relegated to negligibility, and you're on the verge where you could possibly be exterminated. Now, I didn't use the word exterminate, that was Dr. Woodson's word. So this is a powerful thing for these black folk to take up arms and start defending the country.